We've lifted billions of people out of absolute privation and starvation as a consequence of the utilization of fossil fuels, and they're so fundamental that we can't shift away from them rapidly. That's actually practically impossible without tilting people into the kind of abject poverty that's going to cause widespread starvation. It's like, that doesn't sound like a case being made by Satan to me.
No, it's, I mean, I do think that the energy crisis is an enormous educational opportunity. It's obviously a tragedy. And it's, as somebody who's been talking about this for 15 years and advising in the opposite direction, it's very sad to see myself being right in terms of if you artificially restrict the supply of fossil fuels in a world that needs more energy and you don't have a viable near-term replacement, then prices are going to skyrocket, including food prices and the price of everything else. Like this was obvious that this was going to happen, and it's hard to see it. But at least the benefit is that people can see that the establishment has failed. That's the benefit of a crisis. People see the establishment has failed, and the key is, in my view, two things. One is the right people need to be implicated, and the right people need to be vindicated. And I say the right people need to be implicated, not as a vindictive person at all. But it's very important when you have a crisis, and this happened with 9/11, happened with the financial crisis, you need to have some idea of who is responsible and then who was right and gave us better advice. If you look at today's energy crisis, the number one thing that is scary about it is that it is a crisis that has come from the net zero movement, not even only achieving 1% of their goals. So they have not even reduced the supply of fossil fuels. I want to stress that again. They haven't even reduced the supply. They just slowed its rate of growth. They already wanted to dramatically reduce the supply. That was their goal. We were supposed to be using way less fossil fuel by now. They just slowed the growth, and that was enough to cause a global energy crisis in a world that needs far more energy. So that should really wake us up. What if we actually start on their path of getting rid of fossil fuels? And again, we have 27 years now, 27 years and less than a month as we record this to achieve net zero, which in effect means getting rid of fossil fuels. We could talk about offsets and stuff, but that doesn't work at any scale that there's any evidence of. So it's really this homicidal movement in its consequences. And I do think people are waking up, and they're particularly waking up to the idea that, hey, we ignored the benefits of fossil fuels. What I call our designated experts did this. And these people need to be jettisoned. You cannot listen to anybody about energy and climate who ignores the benefits of fossil fuels to billions of people, because if you do, you get an energy crisis. And if we keep listening to them, it's going to get a lot worse.
Well, the other thing that you see being the drum being beaten on the side of the radical left, for example, is the anti-colonial, let's say this continual trumpeting of the anti-colonial interference message. And so then I look at that and I think, well, you give the devil his due, and the fact that the world's cultures have come into contact with one another in a dramatic way in the last 300 years has produced all sorts of consequences, some positive and some negative. But on the anti-colonial front, the environmental proposition, and this is mostly coming from the radical left, is that there's no possible way that the third world inhabitants can be allowed, much less encouraged, to develop a standard of living that in any manner approximates the profligate West. Is that we're rich, and maybe we should suffer from that a bit, and maybe we should pay reparations, let's say. But all those poor people who are desperately trying to clamber up the socioeconomic hierarchy so they don't die, let's make that perfectly clear. They can't be allowed to do that because their environmental footprint will immediately become so large that the planet itself will be destroyed. And so, okay, what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequences of that is that they should be poor and stay that way and should shut the hell up about it and should be happy about it. And perhaps there should be a hell of a lot fewer of them. And if that doesn't trigger your anti-colonialist morality, then you've got some serious thinking to do, because I just don't understand at all how it is that those of us in the wealthy West, and this would certainly include those in the chattering environmental glitterati elite class, I have no sense whatsoever how they're in a moral position to be lecturing the developing world about how they should accept limits to growth, which means, for example, that their children won't have access to enough nutrition to even optimize their brain development as they mature. It's like, oh, that's the price those people get to pay, eh? Those people those poor people in developing countries who don't get to be wealthy. And by wealthy means have enough to eat and have schools to send their children. And we in the Western world, we can sit on our high horse and say, well, we used fossil fuels and oops, sorry about that and all the carbon, but you bastards, you can just accept your lot. And if you stop breeding so goddamn much, that would be a good thing too. Now, how that is colonial to a degree that's overwhelming is beyond me.
Well, it is, and I think it's a very, very powerful argument. And it's been one of these things that has been ignored because the priorities of the modern environmental movement are not what they say. And I would say more broadly, the anti-capitalist movement. They claim to be concerned about the poor, but if you're concerned about the poor and you know that fossil-fueled productivity has brought an unprecedented number of people out of poverty in recent decades, you would think about how do we expand that? How do we replicate what happened in China, what happened in India? Some changes to it, obviously, but how do we, they use 7 times more fossil fuels compared to 40 years ago. Like it's obviously fueled their productivity and their prosperity. Why don't we do more of that? And yet there's been no attention paid in the culture to the energy poor. There's no attention paid to the fact that we have 3 billion people who use less electricity than one of our refrigerators uses. We have 1/3 of the world using wood and animal dung to heat their homes and to cook their food. And in terms of, you're mentioning wealthy people, 3/4 of the world uses an amount of energy that we would consider totally unacceptable in the US or Canada or anything resembling that. So once these facts are pointed out, it is obvious that there is a moral imperative to do at least nothing to get in the way of people using fossil fuels. At least that. And it's clear that the anti-fossil fuel movement is absolutely getting in the way. They're trying to destroy all loans to fossil fuels there. They're trying to encourage them to use things that will not actually work for them. They're trying to, for example, throughout Africa, limit oil and gas development, even though that's a huge potential source of prosperity. But they're not winning this argument once sunlight has been exposed. And I had a personal experience. I don't know if you heard about this, but the Washington Post tried to basically cancel my book.